Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. And today, Professor Van Sittert is going to share his work with us. His paper on Red Captain was pre-circulated, so I don't know if you have had the time to read it, but what we will do, Lance, if that's okay with you, we will follow the usual format of you speaking through to the audience for about half an hour, 35 minutes, and then we'll have 25 minutes for discussion. Okay. Whenever you're ready to start.
Okay. Thanks, colleagues. I really appreciate this. This is a kind of a draft chapter from a project that started in the second half of 2019 when I last had sabbatical. I had 6 months. I've got sabbatical coming up in the middle of the year for a slightly longer period. So for the first time in 18 months, and 2019 seems like 1,000 years ago now, so I'm sure it does to all of you. This was the sort of terminal point of that. So it seemed to me a good idea to just get some comments on it before I went back into the project. So I really appreciate people taking the time. I know it's end of term and there are a lot of other demands. And this is a rather strange format. So I thought what I would
Sorry, Lance. Sorry to interrupt. Is it possible for you to turn on your video?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, just if you have a YouTube version, it will be nice to actually see your face.
Apologies.
Yeah.
Am I up? Oh, hold on. I've got I'm paranoid about cameras on computers. Am I visible now?
Yes. Very visible. Right.
Thanks. So I thought I would just talk a bit about the context and how I came to this topic and where it seems to be going at the moment. The topic arose out of thinking about the sort of mythical commanders of the South African War, which in the sort of post-war nationalist mythology kind of repurposed the defeated Republican armies as indefatigable white warriors. And that kind of image was projected in a fairly ahistorical way, both backwards and forwards, to the periods before the South African War and subsequently. I mean, it's had something of a revision around the centenary of the war, and then around the increasing sort of re-emergence of I guess the conservative white nationalism after '94, and the critique of that, the revisionist critique, the Black Man's War critique, which was based largely on the Cape Colony, people like Warwick and Nasson, Rodney Constantine, Wayne Dooling, Martin Lagasse have all written, which is largely additive and failed to grasp the extent to which, certainly in the Cape Colony, the black population had been largely demilitarized by 1899. So the project is trying to do a genealogy of Cape colonial militias to around 1910 at the moment, just because things have to have an endpoint. And it plots a trajectory from an urban form to a rural form and back to an urban form. And I'll try and sketch that very briefly now. So the Dutch East India Company, as you know, imports the Dutch Republican model of the militia, which is of citizens organized for local defense, electing their own officers, and certainly its original form provisioned by the company and organized in annual musters, and trained essentially in conventional Eurasian warfare through sort of the purpose of the musters was to drill the militias. And the main imagined enemy from the company side was a rival Eurasian war state seeking to take control of the Cape. Once the settler population broke out of the southwestern Cape beachhead and entered the interior, the argument that I'm wanting to make is that imported model becomes Africanized on this, what Nigel Penn's kind of called the northern frontier. Although I think that, yeah, I'll use that formulation and we can talk about it. People are happy with that. And in which the change that happened is that kinship rather than citizenship becomes the organizing form of the militia. The militia itself is creolized, increasing inclusion, or not increasing, the simple inclusion of both black kin and clans. The militias become self-provisioning and also self-mustering. I mean, they are activated independently of the company, and the form of warfare that they practice shifts as well away from conventional Eurasian warfare to ambush warfare. So these small numbers, small forces, short campaigns, really limited by what these groups can actually carry with them, and fairly effective against low population densities in arid environment. And there's the Shell and Gelk argument that settlement moves is able to move across the first half of the 18th century because permanent water sources are relatively limited, and if you can seize and hold those, you can control large hinterlands. And I'm interested in what I've called, for want of a better term, 4 hinge moments. So the first hinge moment, I think, is the crisis in the mid-1770s, which is this kind of acknowledged but otherwise ignored guerrilla war that rages for a generation, the final quarter of the 18th century, particularly in the northeast and the east, where these small militia forces encounter for the first time agri-pastoralist populations that are able to field equivalent, if not larger, militias of their own, are able to conduct organized, coordinated campaigns across large fronts, and are able to sustain those over longer periods. And so it's in this context that this kind of feral form of this original Dutch import becomes institutionalized, with a view to try and create larger forces and that are able to campaign for longer periods. So for the first time, the indigenous population, and again, the terminology is slippery. I mean, I've used terminology in 2019 that's in the paper. If you had a look at it, that I wasn't comfortable with then. I probably need to revisit now. Black clans, however you want to describe them, whatever term you use, become liable for military service, essentially, can be called up for the militia. A new rank structure is introduced that enables, that supersedes the elected officer norm, to enable this larger force to be organized on outside of the simply local. And the company for the first time provides an ammunition subsidy to this frontier form. And the paper that you have is really around that first hinge moment and looking at, I mean, it kind of rehearses something of the background that I've just given you, and it looks at a particular frontier warlord who has a certain presence in the archive, partly because he himself was literate and partly because he has he plays quite a prominent role in several moments, which the paper looks at. I think the second hinge moment around the militia comes with this. It's called the frontier war, right? And again, problematic terminology. The conflict from roughly 1799 to 1803, which other historians have called popular uprising, basically the large-scale defection of black clients and the rout of the remnant white militias. I mean, the frontier is pushed back almost halfway to Cape Town. Hundreds of farms are raised, many settler casualties, large loss of livestock. And that's essentially the context that the British inherit of this situation in which the settler militias have effectively been defeated. And again, that third frontier war is almost no secondary literature. The sort of 19th century frontier wars have substantial bodies of writing about them and continue to generate substantial bodies of writing. But that particular conflict, or that particular moment, is another silence, which I think is an important silence, because I think the effect of the silence, like the guerrilla war on the escarpment edge in the final quarter of the 18th century, is part of the mythology. It simply edits out some of the more contingent moments. And the British response to that is to essentially demobilize the settler militias, effectively cutting off their ammunition supplies, because these militias, as you will have seen if you looked at the paper, organize lead rebellions. In fact, set up their own republic in the dying years of the Dutch East India Company, and again at the turn of the century. And in addition to cutting off the ammunition supply, they strip out essentially the black auxiliaries, who are really the fighting, the sort of the core of these frontier militias are actually the black auxiliaries. They're not these kin organized white militias, who are very casualty averse and who rely on anything beyond ambush. I mean, siege warfare becomes a more prominent in the final quarter of the 18th century, and those sieges are all conducted by essentially black infantry. And out of that hinge moment, the second sort of focus, and the one I guess I have to look at now, I'm trying to think about now, is looking at trying to write the history of these institutionalized black militias. The most obviously the unit which, or an organization which has many names, but probably for the longest period is referred to as the Cape Mounted Rifles, and then also the recovery by the British of the so-called Mfengu in the 1830s. And the argument that second paper wants to make is that essentially the wars of the first half of the 19th century are essentially fought on the Cape side largely by black soldiers, whether in the Cape Regiment or the Mounted Rifles, whichever, in Cape Cavalry. It has various names, and the Mfengu militias that are used as auxiliaries to the British military. And the third hinge moment is the third crisis comes in the mid 19th century, in the Cape Mounted Rifles rebellion in 1851, which precedes the Indian Mutiny and leads to a very conscious and very public decision towards black demilitarization and to white remilitarization in the mid 19th century. And so the third sort of chapter, I guess, that I have to develop is around this anglicized settler militia that's also institutionalized after representative government, this force called the Frontier Armed and Mounted Police. Also, it carries the name of its the main settler warlord, a man called Walter Curry, who organizes and comes to lead that force. And after responsible government in 72, there's an increasingly aggressive promotion of a settler soldier mythology, this idea that settlers, a race-based idea that indigenous peoples are unable to fight, and that settlers, by virtue of their fitness on the frontier, border farmers are essentially natural soldiers. They can shoot and they can ride and they can beat anyone. And on the basis of this, there are so-called yeomanry regiments organized, volunteer regiments, and the mass militia is reactivated, both black and white. And that precipitates the fourth crisis. So the rebellion is also silence, right? It's caught up in the Cat River rebellion, and it's dealt with in that way as a kind of incidental feature of that. I think it warrants more, it has a much more central role. And the fourth crisis then is the gun war, which is the great another great silence in 19th century historiography, which is effectively this settler army seeking to disarm. I mean, that's the ostensive reason for the war, is to disarm the Basotho, and resoundingly defeated. Again, it's, you know, wherever the silences are always on defeats. So I think the gun war is a crucial hinge moment as well. And following that, there's a very conscious move to professionalize and to urbanize the white militias. So the volunteer regiments are funded and are drilled, and the urban volunteers are quite happy to take on the sort of trappings of imperial military training and regiments and ranks and all of these things, and also cadets. I mean, there's a very conscious attempt to systematically organize essentially child soldiers, right? So the schools become a key site, and so that kind of process, I guess, is the fourth kind of focus that I need to develop in the coming sabbatical. And linked to that is a demilitarization of the essentially Dutch countryside, where the defeat in the gun war is to a large extent blamed on the failures of the sort of Dutch militias. So that's the bigger project, as much as I can see it at the moment. The paper that you looked at, and I'll just finish, I'm conscious of the time and on rips, I'll just summarize or go through the conclusions of the paper and then leave it at that. So the paper argues that the evolution of the settler militia in the second half of the 18th century can be tracked through this individual, Adrian van Jaarsveld, who's this settler warlord, I guess, on a trajectory that moves from west to east. So he begins on the northern frontier, and he moves continuously until he ends up on the east. Eurasian urban middle class social form was transposed onto southern Africa in service of Dutch mercantilism. The militia was intended to provide the company with savings on defense costs of its refreshment station by drilling the settler population of the Cape Peninsula to defend against maritime invasion. Beyond the Cape Peninsula, the militia went feral, miscegenating with indigenous organizational forms to throw off a sport, the frontier militia. The latter was Eurasian in language and structure of command, essentially based around the idea of Dutch cavalry and its weaponry, its use of firearms, and its use of horses. It's African in its recruitment. It's recruitment of kin and clans, or recruitment based on kinship and clientage, and its tactics, the use of ambush warfare. It evolved on the northern frontier of the first half of the 18th century, where aridity compelled transhumance and low population densities as a mechanism for raiding and recovering livestock. Small, self-mobilizing and self-provisioning kin and clan forces were able to deploy for short periods in fast-moving and wide-ranging razzias and pursuits. The labor demands of pastoralism, availability of water and grazing, and horse sickness confined them to brief annual spring campaign season. Aridity also acted as a force multiplier, requiring settler militias to seize only the few permanent water sources in order to subdue their vast hinterlands. These militias were the cutting edge of the pastoral frontier, in which the sizable subpopulation of young, single-armed men trained in practicing collective violence, like van Jaarsveld and the Neverveld in the 1760s, were disproportionately represented. The feral frontier form of the Eurasian militia had reached its limit by the 1760s, as the colonial pastoral frontier approached the interior escarpment in the better watered east and encountered indigenous populations at higher densities, able to mobilize and coordinate large militias of their own to counterattack settler farms in numbers and breadth for sustained periods. Such counterattacks severely depleted and prevented local settler militia mobilizations by forcing settler men and their all-known clans to remain at home to defend their farms. Scattered and isolated from each other, settlers held out for as long as their ammunition did and then fled, opening gaps in the line, which left the remaining settlers more exposed and thus easier to displace. Indigenous counterattacks also encouraged the defection of all-known clans, pushed into the front line of violence as herds on the farms and spies and infantry in the field. and exposed the parsimony of the company, which collected land rent and taxes, but expected settlers to provide for their own defense. These were the problems that institutionalization of the frontier militias in 1774 sought to address, increasing the labor pool, subsidizing the ammunition supply, and restructuring the leadership to enable them to mobilize forces large enough to match those of their indigenous opponents. The Northern Frontier Militia's local kin and client makeup, however, made it strongly resistant to scaling up, as van Jaarsveld's decade-long frustration and humiliation by the Swellendammers made starkly clear. The new senior field ranks created and appointed by the company lacked popular legitimacy, with a settler rank and file which hailed each other as cousin, lived in a democracy of poverty on the frontier without owing customary deference to an elite, and elected its own corporals. Both militia officers and men refused to take the field with predominantly or exclusively all-armed forces for the same reason. Black auxiliary forces, again, there was a term I was using, which I'm not sure works, but for the same reason, fear of losing status, although all-armed clients were much more amenable to the authority of senior officers and magistrates than the intractable settler confederations of cousins. Settler status was also officially protected against all-armization by prohibitions on all-arms owning firearms or horses, guaranteeing that the settler militia's sole advantage, the monopoly on firearms, had been lost by the late 1780s. The only reliable way of overcoming local kin and client loyalties and raising a settler militia of any size was through some form of public subsidy. The company, however, was parsimonious with its ammunition supply and refused to allow settlers to write off rent arrears or remunerate themselves through plunder. And one could say a part of that plunder would be slaving, right? In fact, Thierry Rousseau and I have a chapter in Muhammad Adhikari's latest book, The Civilian-Driven Violence. There's a chapter on this if you want more of the sort of empirical detail, which isn't in this paper. The result was that even after institutionalization, the settler frontier militias remained local kin and client forces that increasingly found themselves overmatched in the field and unable to prevent the stalling and rollback of the pastoral frontier along the escarpment edge, and deepening immiseration of the settler population. The frontier militia rebellions that followed were ironically incapacitated and ultimately undone by the same combination of fierce localism and want of subsidy that thwarted company institutionalization. So that the first rebellion did not even warrant a military response from the colony's new British rulers, nor the second the capital punishment of its ringleaders. The British, of course, changed by the so-called Slachter's Neck Rebellion, which is another rebellion, settler militia rebellion in 1815. They, of course, hang everyone. And they're very conscious in doing that of wanting to stamp out this recurrent, what they perceive as a recurrent militia insurrection in the East. The British solution to the challenge of the settler militias at this point was rather to demobilize it by cutting off its ammunition supply and stripping out its all auxiliaries into the Imperial Army. So the Cape Regiment is unique in several ways within the Imperial military. One of them is that the soldiers are able to bring family with them, right? So these garrison, the Cape Regiment garrison, and it's into the 1820s, has wives and children, and they're all on they're provisioned as part of the payment of the soldier. I think that's kind of it from my side. Sorry, it was a little rusty. It's
No, not at all. I'm just seeing that it's 1:24. So if you want to take a little more time, you can. Yeah.
I don't really know what I'd use that time for. I mean, the paper is.
No, you don't have to. I'm just saying.
Yeah, no. Well, I mean, let me just. If people haven't looked at the first third of the paper, basically rehearses the argument around the transformation, I guess, of the militia form from its original Dutch importation to its frontier form. And then the bulk of the paper is really a biography of van Jaarsveld, but it's tracking the development of that form through his biography, and I think that's a kind of, that model is what I want to try and do with all of them. So to tell each of these look at each of these hinges through the biography of some key player. I mean, the big challenge that I'm facing as I look at the second hinge is to find anything at all on the Cape Regiment or the Cape Mounted Rifles that is actually about individual soldiers. And the only source I have that has any of that are the desertion advertisements. So I'm currently grappling with how one writes a history of a black colonial militia when one doesn't really have sources, and the only sources you have are this kind of strange source that's slightly different than the Mfengu, and there's a particular, I guess, a black warlord called Veldman Bekicha, John Bekicha, who ends up meeting Queen Victoria in 1891, is much celebrated and feted, and so that I kind of have that, and it's a challenge. And then, of course, the subsequent to the any number of candidates that one can work with. So it's kind of trying to use biography, I guess, to look at these big shifts, and in doing that to try and recapture some of the politics of the form and of the moment, and by doing that, I think I hope recapture some of the contingent nature, because so much of what's written about this is written, it's like history doing backwards. I mean, everyone knows that or we think we know that in 1910 there was a settler nation state. So some of the literature on this individual and these moments, almost inadvertently and sometimes deliberately. I mean, Eric Walker, for example, is very dismissive, and of course the settler militia state making continues on the Highveld, right? The endless proliferation of these militia republics that are formed and collapse and are merged and then split apart again. So it's I guess the ultimate aim is to try and rethink this very settled narrative of a sort of inevitable rollout of the colonial state, or even just talking about the colonial state as an actor and an entity through the sort of contingency of biography and actually some of the fine grained stuff. I think I'm close enough to
Okay.
put me out of my misery.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you for that. We already have Nigel. Please go ahead. And yeah, Nigel, then Bodhi. Yes, please.
Thanks. Hi,
Hey,
Lance and others. Sorry, I was a bit late in joining, but technical problems. But Lance, I've got my main comments are to do with the first third of the paper,
yes,
rather than the second third, which firstly, I'm a bit puzzled why you're sort of dishing the whole use of the term or the concept, the commando system, and why you are choosing to talk about a settler militia, because there's quite a substantial literature, as you know, which approaches the problem that you are writing about through the lens or the concept or the idea of the commando system. And in fact, it was Legassic who refers to the commando system as being the most important political institution of the frontier zone. And then you had Jutta Lau, who tried to give a Marxist spin on this. And then my own work, which looked a lot at the commando system, particularly its evolution in, as you correctly say, the 18th century northern frontier in this arid region devoted to pastoralism. My own work goes into a lot of detail about this, and in many respects, we're very close. Our findings and our conclusions are the same. But I'm puzzled why you don't sort of engage with any of the other historians. The only historiography you sort of mention here is really Moody. And there's one reference to Gelke, and a few references later on to Perez. You don't take us through a historiographical debate on the evolution of your own ideas compared to the ideas of other people. So
Sure.
a student coming to this subject for the first time through your paper would basically not be aware of the existing historiography, and I'm
Yeah.
be aware of really how your stance is different in some ways
Yeah.
to the stance of other people. So here, you know, I'm a bit disturbed that if this is an exercise in, as it were, students, this is a research paper. Obviously, this is a research paper, but the research paper, I think, ought to talk about its the evolution of ideas in sort of a dynamic relationship with the existing historiography. And you know, here I'm sort of, I won't say upset, but I'm curious to know why there isn't this. Why Penn, for instance, The Forgotten Frontier,
Yeah.
and Penn's thesis, and Susie Newton King, and Gassick, and Hillamy, and you know, Mustard, and all of these other sort of people who've written about the frontier. Why you don't take this on? You don't really explain why you're ditching the whole idea of the commando system and replacing it with the settler militia. I suspect because you want to draw parallels to this settler militia and other similar forms of settler militia, say in Australia or North America or wherever. But I think you need to justify that. I think you also need to look more at other people who've written about Adrian van Jaarsveld. I mean, if you look through the authors I've just mentioned, there are many references to him. And once again, you don't discuss what other people have said about him, apart from a sort of a genealogical study of the van Jaarsvelds. You don't look at Susie Newton King. So these are some of my concerns. I have more detailed, specific criticisms, you know, which there's probably not time to go into, but just one point. You sort of tend to criticize those historians who tend to sort of throw a blanket cover over white settlers and not seeing the different layers of hierarchy within them. But this is also true of the Trekboers. You one state quote, I think, Gelke with approval to say that on the frontier there was a leveling off of inequality, that everybody sunk to a lowest common denominator. And yet many of the people you write about are actually elites amongst this so-called egalitarian frontier society. The commando leaders, Veldwachtmeesters, Van Jaarsveld himself, these are wealthy elites amongst other poorer Trekboers. And the point about these Trekboers is that perhaps the majority of them didn't actually pay their own loan farm rental. The loan farms were being paid for by the good old so-called Cape gentry back in the southwestern Cape, who were putting up the money for these propertyless and poverty-stricken Trekboers on the frontier. So there is perhaps more of a class division than certain passages of your thesis suggest. But that isn't my main point. My main point is, why ditch the commando system and why not discuss the existing historiography? I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you, Nigel. Do you want to deal with that historiographical gauntlet?
I think I should.
Immediately?
I mean, there's a lot
Of course.
A lot of substantial issues.
Yeah.
If you don't mind,
Yes.
So I think the key.
Bodhi has a question after this. We'll come to Bodhi's question after this. Yeah. Thank you, Nigel. Thank you for.
I don't know how much of the introduction you heard, but the key indicator is on the first page of the paper, which this is a draft, and very much a draft. But it's the second chapter, right? So the literature that you cite would be dealt with in the first chapter of the envisaged, I guess, book. I mean, I hesitate to call it that, but I guess I should. So I, very much intend to engage with that literature. In terms of why I haven't used the term commandos, I guess because of the associations, and maybe they're just my associations. and they're not associations from this period. They're associations that I think are attached much later, but are very hard to get away from. So the use of the term militia was a conscious attempt to not use commander with its associations, because I'm interested in I guess the Creole nature of these war bands or whatever, of these militias.
I can understand your sort of sensitivity that, you know, commanders become units in the SADF and have a certain glamour or farm defense systems. But the commander has a sort of indigenous specificity, which you seem to value so much in your own excavation. You know, the Ualam component, the indigenous component, the specific environmental and pastoralist origins of the commando system, I think are somewhat lost if you use a term like settler militia. This is
no, sure. Look, I mean, as I said, this is a draft, and it was a draft from 2 years ago, so it's by no means a finished product at all. But in terms of writing it and just my own thinking from 2 years ago, was to, I guess, to try and estrange myself from all of that, right, and all of those associations, which are really 20th century associations, and to force myself to always to try and keep myself consciously aware of what it was I was writing about, not to lapse into shorthands, because I think those 20th century shorthands tend to, with the best intentions, I mean, it's very hard to, and also in readers, I mean, I think if you use the term commander, it conjures a certain set of associations. So it was a deliberate strategy. I mean, whether it survives to the end product is neither here nor there. And I mean, you know, your comment will obviously, I'll have to rethink that. In terms of the associations, I'm less interested in other settler militias than I am in thinking about indigenous societies as similarly having militias. Because I think there are a lot of similarities between the way in which these forces that this chapter is looking at are organized, and the way that the forces that they are contending with. And I'm thinking of, you know, some of the Sam Chalice, Rachel King, and some of the ways in which the sort of older, I mean, Schuler Marx's treatment of this, the guerrilla war at the end of the 1880s, talks about Bushmen, right? And that, you know, that term as well also conjures a whole series of associations. And I think that it's not clear to me who these forces are, and certainly in the rebellions in the 1790s, I mean, there clearly are African allies for these settler groups, whether you think of those merely as rhetorical. And I mean, in the paper, the Van Jaarsveld claimed to have had to be working in close association with Arabia and so on. I'm skeptical of. So I guess it's trying to keep to keep it strange in my own head, and it's really it was just a writing tactic, which maybe needs to. I'm not, you know, it's useful to me at the moment to talk about it in that way. In terms of whether Van Jaarsveld can be thought of as elite, I mean, I've used the Opgraaf data. I mean, it's not in this paper because the work was done subsequently. But I mean, it's very easy to see, and, you know, whatever wealth he had is also very, very rapidly impoverished across the final quarter of the 19th century. Now, whether, you know, you accept the sort of mania critique that they're all lying about how many cattle they actually have, and in fact, all these Opgraaf, all this data is of no use, right? It doesn't. So they list, I forget what the figures are, I think 8,000, and they claim 60,000, and so mania is very scathing about that. But, you know, even allowing for that, there's very little evidence that these officers are substantially wealthier than the sort of rank and file. And there's a lot of evidence over this period that in fact both the officers and rank and file are being impoverished. I mean, Van Jaarsveld, as you know, is what finally undoes him as his fraud, basically. I mean, he's unable to make his payment, and he forges a receipt, basically, which is what may or may not be critical to his role in those rebellions. But so I don't. Yeah, I mean, it's not clear to me from the Opkaaf data that there is, you know, Johan Fourie has now digitized the whole all the Opkaaf data for this area in this period. So it's quite easy to show. And the chapter that Terry and I did in Mohammed's book, there's very little evidence there of a substantial local elite who are, you know, growing wealthy and so on. I know that's, you know, it's a key component of it's an element of Susie's argument, and it's certainly the big project of Johan's, right, to show that in fact all of these there was capital formation and so on. But maybe that's a different. I mean, we can have another discussion about that. I don't know.
Yeah, well,
I don't know if that addresses it.
Yes, I was more thinking of the I forget the exact figure, but perhaps a half to 2/3 of loan farms were actually taken out by the Cape gentry. So I'm agreeing with you. There's a high degree of poverty on the frontier. But there's also a high degree of, as it were, investment in those loan farms by well-to-do burghers sitting back in the southwestern Cape.
Sure.
And it took, I think, I remember from my research, the absolute minimum you needed to start off as a farmer on the frontier was about 300 sheep, which is it's not an insubstantial amount. And the annual loan farm rental is 24 Rijksdollars a year, is the annual salary of a soldier in the VOC, which is also not an insubstantial amount. Sure. So it looks like nothing to be a frontier farmer, but it's actually quite a big investment in money to have a loan farm and to have the flocks and herds and the wagon and the horse and the firearms.
Sure.
And stuff.
Sure.
Sorry, Nigel. This is a very fascinating conversation, and maybe Lance, you can respond to Nigel's rejoinder. But Bodhi has a question. If you can just, you know,
okay.
Otherwise he has a class.
Yeah.
Please go ahead, Bodhi.
Thank you. Thanks. In fact, my question kind of continues some of these discussions because I'm kind of surprised, Lance, to see that how quickly you conceded the point, because I thought that usually kind of the deployment of the term militia actually connects us to a much larger, wider historiography of that is particularly kind of active in England and the Netherlands of this time. So first of all, I really kind of enjoyed reading the paper, learned a great deal, and congratulations on the last section particularly. I think it's exemplary in its condensation of a very complex, very, very layered process. But my question is about the history of the form, right? You know, of all your kind of amazingly suggestive and wicked signature phrases, democracy of poverty, confederations of cousins, I want to pick up on an expression that you use twice or thrice, which is the feudal frontier form, right? And more than once you write about the European burgher model going feral on the pastoral frontier. And my dissatisfaction is that this promise of ferality soon becomes kind of adapted to a very familiar and slightly reduced version of creolization. So the argument seems to be that the structure of command and weaponry remain European, while recruitment strategy and battle tactics are going African. Now, to my mind, this in a certain way reproduces the old liberal faith in an kind of unsurmountable distinction between citizenship and kinship. And I'm thinking here with the aid of a few scattered readings in European history, and I'm not sure whether this will make sense, but kind of to express this without any frills, my suspicion is that you are taking the form that was about to be imported to the colony as already settled in contemporary Europe. And my sense is it is absolutely not.
Right.
There is a whole host of debates in England and Netherlands of the 18th century, the energization of the neo-Machiavellian defense, the championing of the militia form against the standing army form by Andrew Fletcher in Georgian England, right? Who's essentially arguing for a restoration of the medieval kinship-based form of militia. I'm thinking of Hoffa's book, that Warfare in Medieval Brabant, right? Which shows that the kinship structure does not get completely displaced by citizenship in early modern Netherlands, despite the claim of the Dutch revolutionaries otherwise. I'm thinking of Martin Pracht's work, who's kind of talking about that there are two models of recruitment, the territorial model, which is more aligned to the citizenship argument, but there is also the corporate models, right? Which is kind of, territorial model, which is kind of more aligned with the kinship strategy. Corporate model is more aligned with the citizenship. So these things are still bubbling, still taking a lot of place in the periodical and pamphlets of England and Netherlands, particularly. Thinking of Matthew McCormack's work, right? I mean, which is I don't know if you have had a look at that book, but I found it fascinating in terms of thinking about 18th century British militias. So what I'm trying to say is that perhaps trying to think of putting more focus on the assembling and disassembling of the war machine on the ground makes more sense, rather than continuing to write in the shadow of the anticipation of this citizen soldier versus professional soldier debate. Right. And I'm thinking of I'm taking the centrality of the Orlam thing very, very seriously, because it reminds me of, I was thinking the same thing in around the Kupapa Maoris, right? In much later, 1860s New Zealand, or the Kuki levies in 40s Northeastern India. You always have these, there's a particular form in the northeastern frontier of British India called Sebandis, which is actually taking some of these militia forms, but which is much more open to kind of formally admitting, quite like this Orlam stuff that you discussed, and they give it a different name. So this process continues across different settler empires in different kind of situations, right? And what I'm trying to say is that whether this whole model of importation, creolization, and then this kind of, particularly that the command structure somehow remains European and the battle tactics goes African, I think it does a disservice to the complexity that the rest of the paper actually provides. I mean, this is kind of my, sorry. But
No, that's very useful. And I mean, it kind of, both you and Nigel are pointing me back to the secondary literature, which I guess I'm busy assembling, and I didn't really have a chance to engage in the 6 months I had in 2019. I mean, I hear you completely on I've just started reading Crack, in fact, last night. And the formulation is too simplistic. And it's too simplistic in terms of the international literature, and it's also, I think I obviously need to go back to the South African 18th century frontier literature as well, and reread all of that. I'm not. You started off by saying I conceded the point on militia too easily, and I'm not sure what.
Well, that's
I'm not sure I understood that. Oh, okay.
No, because I'm thinking that you said, what I meant is that you said that I'm not trying to think about settler militia as a form in general across the world. But I do think that this particular narrative actually does the opposite. It does refer us back to a certain kind of resonance, which
Yeah.
is much better captured by the term militia than commando,
Yeah.
because there is actually an explicit debate in England and Netherlands, among other places, definitely in Germany as well, but which definitely seizes on the idea of militia, which is kind of then being reworked into, you know, whether it is Sebandi in India or commando in South Africa. But there is an certain kind of emergent structure of global war machine in which it does play a part. And that's where I thought, like, then rather than pursuing that and kind of making a step towards that, I thought you were conceding this chance of connecting and going back to a very different kind of historiographical tradition, which remained very focused on the Southern African experience in terms of a certain kind of exceptionalism.
Yeah, no, that's very useful. Thank you. That's very useful.
Okay. Sorry, Bodhi, do you have another question? Is that an old?
No,
is that an old hand?
That's an old hand. Sorry, I'm just about to.
Okay. Thank you for that, Nigel and Bodhi. I think there's a lot for all of us to kind of dwell on. Other questions, comments we have about Kurt? Please go ahead.
Sorry, I'm used to using Teams. I'm not a Zoom fan.
Yeah. Okay.
Just to follow just to say hi, then I'll switch my camera off again.
Hey, Kurt.
Hi.
Thanks so much for being here, man.
No, but you see, what's really fascinating me is that so I'm reading this thing and I'm getting a strong sense that you also, in my mind, sort of creating the silhouette of a very specific kind of masculinity, right? So in many ways, you use the term, commando. There's the idea of kinsmanship. There's the idea of different racial positions. There's the idea of the homestead. There's the idea of the rebel. And in my mind, in my kind of intellectual universe, you've got the construction lines. You have a very particular masculinity that is being poured. And where I knew that wasn't something that was just maybe a lonely impulse of delight was when you put the crest, the seat. And I thought to myself, what kind of a man is this that has got aspirations to have heraldry in relation to this genocide that he's enacting? And I'm desperate to find out, that there's a self-craft element going on here. It's this guy that sees himself and collects himself from his limitations, but at the same time wants a certain visage. It's very clear, you emphatically state that in your paper, based on the research, his own assertion of who he wants to be, his own rank, his own position. It's kind of, it's for me, it glimmers in the paper. And then I also ask myself, are there any, certainly an egotistical man like this, as I read him, would have a portrait, there would have had to have been some kind of semblance of his personhood manifest visually. Is there no, if we've got images or second or third hand accounts of the visual depiction of somebody like Hintze or somebody like, those kind of chiefs, surely this man who sees himself as a chief in a different way, is there no visual record, Lance, that would change, that would set this red cap ablaze in my imagination?
Yeah, I haven't found it if it is, and maybe Nigel can comment on that. I've looked, but I was surprised. I mean, I don't even know what Nigel's take on the heraldry is, because it's a strange, there's no, the artifact is in the archive, but there's no metadata around the artifact at all. So I kind of used it, or I put it in there as much as a note to myself as anything else, because I had the same kind of, it was interesting to me because of the self representation that it implied. So I haven't found any, in fact, and I don't know if Nigel's still in the room, but
yes, I am. No, I haven't found anything. I imagine that he was called the Red Captain maybe because he had red hair, but
I don't know. It's something that I wanted to talk to Atambile about, actually, because I've only seen it in translation, so I don't know what it is. That's I think it's in Brownlee reports this this oral tradition from the mid-19th century. So it's one of the leads that I need to follow up. Yeah. So sorry, Kurt, I can't do better than what I've got.
No, it was a gift. It was a gift. Just
yeah, no, I felt the same way. I mean, I was so surprised by it, and I kind of sat and stared at it for far longer than one should stare at these things.
Yeah.
Trying to, get at what was behind it.
Yeah, because for me, I see it as a logic as well in his own mind. It's kind of a paradigm that he masters to, in my view, in my kind of method, this guy's narrative that you provide, which is like it should be an episode of Mind Anchors or something. But it's a justification, and I mean, I think it's almost a justification in terms of the stance he takes. It's kind of like, I mean, that's just the way that I'm reading it, because if you, I mean, it's just, I was floored. I was just floored when I saw that this was the aspirational symbol that was.
It's consistent with the remnants that we have in the sort of written record. I mean, he very clearly has an image of himself, and it's continually frustrated, and it's not accorded the sort of recognition that he thinks it's due. At least that seems to me to be the case. But he's also, in other respects, slightly. Yeah, I mean, it's the problem with biography, right? And I didn't know how to do it, but it seemed to me a way of getting at of trying to recover some of the politics. But there's a danger that you get sucked into, like, the sort of inner landscape, or the personal psychology and stuff. He's also a mass murderer, right? I mean, he's a war, today he'd be a war criminal.
Yeah.
And the premeditation and the scale of that is, so it's I don't know. I'm not entirely happy with anything in the chapter. I mean, I'm much less happy now than I was at 1 o'clock. But it's one of the things I think that it's a key element that I need to look at and go back to.
Fascinating.
Thanks, Kurt. Thanks for the question. Last question. We have 2 minutes before I have to also vacate the room for these last question comments before we close. Okay, I don't see a hand, but thank you, Lance. Then, Shamil, yes, please go ahead. Yes, Shamil.
Hi, Lance. Sorry.
Hey, Shamil.
Sorry, I also had a problem. Came late. Every time think I'm going to find the link in the email. And run around looking. And
you've got to click on the Zoom thing in the poster.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah.
It doesn't work either.
Yeah, I also felt, I first did history at UWC, where it was still taught by the old school, terrible. And I remember this very well, because these rebellions, it was all part of the white man's history, And I thought, Helium, you must have said something. I mean, I'm not a specialist in this at all.
No.
I don't, unlike Nigel, who's a specialist in this, will say, and I'm sure you know the historiography, but you're not wanting to rehearse that, because it can take up a lot of it, can turn it into a 70-page paper.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering, who's your audience, I mean, if you're writing for people like Nigel and Susie or not, who will know the historiography, a new generation of readers, or for me, so I was a bit unclear as to your audience is for this.
That's a good question.
This book or whatever. And then if you're going to do something which is accessible, there's a lot of the sort of early part which could be taken out or something. Anyway, so
Sure.
I just had a
Sure.
problem of who are you
Yeah,
writing?
yeah. No, it's a good question, and I can't answer it, as you can tell, because I'm deflecting here. So it's something to think about. I mean, it obviously has to be academic, right?
Yeah, but I mean, I'm thinking of of somebody like Hobsbawm or these writers who wrote and transformed things and our understanding of history, or that just comes off the top of my head. But also wrote that can be read widely. So that's what I've just been very interested in, that, and models of that kind of writing. That makes a contribution that's based on, I mean, on sources, but that's also accessible.
Yeah. No, thank you. I'll, it's something to, I mean, ideally, I would obviously like it to be both, but there's always a trade-off one way or the other, right? I think to resonate to have some sort of popular resonance, I would have to follow Nigel's advice and refer to commandos, for example. That would make the links and stuff.
Have you read Land Wars? Maybe that's some example of what Shamil is trying to.
What do you think of it, Nigel?
I think it's a very useful summary, a very good narrative summary. But I think you're trying to do more than that. You're trying to bring original conceptual insights to the well-worn material. But I do can't kick out the baby with the bathwater.
Yeah.
You have to keep.
I know. I think it's
foundations.
It's very difficult to not just tell the same story again, right? I mean, that's I guess where it became clear to me that I had to try and use different terms just to not fall into the well-worn narratives. And it hasn't. I mean, I think the way to really open this paper up, or this draft up, is to actually explore the alliances on the other side of the frontier, because that, as long as the focus which this draft has is still on the opposition to whatever authority is in Cape Town, it doesn't really, to really break out of that, it needs to actually show and explore those relationships or those alliances or the claims. But someone like Bates, as you know, is kind of, I don't know. I mean, I is poorly served in the historiography, I think, and it's a difficult period. I mean, it's impenetrable, and I lack your language competence in reading those old those records. So it's kind of doubly opaque to me. And I guess
sorry, I'll have to close the meeting here because I have both these classes here.
Sorry,
Lance, we'll have to have a private discussion.
Sometime. I'll do that, Nigel. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, we're done. Thank you everyone for being here. We'll have another seminar. Tinashe is our postdoctoral fellow, is going to present next week. So see you there.